I just want to stretch that across there, and its job is just to put a bit of tension on this so it doesn't fall out, because otherwise you can be sure it will. Right, that's the front part of the camera done. I'm not putting the door on just yet because I don't need to. Let's lock lever and release lever next go into the body. So a wipe of molybdenum paste down there, that's probably too much, and there, in that guide post hole there, and on that front edge there, that's where the spring on the release lever runs. Release lever and lock lever. Lock lever, the lock lever's job is to lock the film advance when the frame counter reaches number 1. Which is just about the signature trait for Retina cameras, or for a lot of Retina cameras, and particularly before the internet, when knowledge was easy to get, you could often buy Retina cameras that people thought were jammed because they didn't know, and as a result, if you knew that the frame counter was on number 1, you could potentially pick up a bargain. Right, so I've got the spring on the release lever. I've got that sitting in position, and it's spring. There are 2 springs that look very much the same. The finer of the 2 springs is for the lock lever. The coarser of the 2 springs, the one with more coils and heavier coils, is for the release lever. So get that in place. And the screw for this is there. And the shaft this screws into is split at the top, which grips the screw, so it means that it's hard getting the screw started sometimes. That went well enough. Just check that my shutter release is at the top of the shaft. It is, and I need to come down a bit more with that. Probably that's plenty. The lock lever, that can go in. The lock lever has the lighter of the 2 springs fitted, and the spring is retained with a C clip or an E clip. Which is here. So I've got to get that fitted. So holding the spring back with my thumb, I'll get that C clip in the groove and snap it into position. That's good. And usually I rotate that so that the open side is towards the front of the camera. It just gives me a little bit more clearance for the film release lever. Alright, so those 2 levers are in place. And the next thing I need to worry about is my film take-up spool and its metal bush, which goes in the base. Now open the back of the camera, pop that in loosely into position. I want my take-up shaft, my film advance shaft. So I've got to look at this first and make sure that the cam on the end of the shaft is not loose. Because often if the camera's been dropped, this is loose where it's riveted onto the end of the post and or bent. That one seems fine. So I've got to lubricate that. Now where this runs through this bush, normally I lubricate that with some graphite grease because I like the feel of it. It seems to work well. I'll find it. Right, so I usually just pull that bush back up against the spring. Make sure I rub plenty on the shaft. And the bush will push half of that grease back out the way, but the other half will stay there. And above the bush, I normally apply some grease there. And check that the bush, as I pull the bush back, just check that that shaft is well greased. It appears to be good. I'll apply some to the spring so that the coils of the spring will move smoothly over each other. That's that one. Now the cam surfaces here that track the release lever and the lock lever, normally I just lubricate these with a bit of synthetic grease. This is like a ratchet. It ensures that the film advance lever can only be swung in the forward direction when you're advancing the film, and then when it reaches the end of the stroke it reverses and it can go back the other way. You cannot inch the lever. It can only go through complete strokes. And that ratchet ensures that that's the case. So we've got 3 screws here, nickel plated. All of these screws look much the same because they've been through the cleaner, and so virtually all traces of glue and so forth are gone from them. Otherwise, it's the 3 clean ones that you're looking for, the ones that didn't have any glue on them. So that's in place. At the top of the camera, we've got to put the clutch in next, and our clutch consists of 3 pieces. There's 2 of them. Where's our third? The third piece is here. Usually I use graphite grease again on the clutch. So I apply some to the inside of the shell. Fit the spring in place. Now this has got a little tab that drops into a notch here. And then we've got to compress this spring and get it into the case or the shell. So what I normally do is hook this crimp pliers over the top, just hold that lightly, then rotate it, keeping my tension on it, and then I can slip it into there. So there it is, that's the clutch assembled. Now the clutch will be smoother in one direction than the other. Now that's normal, and the direction it's smooth in is the direction it needs to move. Give that a wipe of grease on the inside. I've used some synthetic grease there. Drop that into place. It'll engage with the film take-up spool. Now I've just popped that's the surround for the back catch cover. I've popped that underneath just to support the film advance shaft while I assemble the rest of the stuff, because otherwise it has a tendency to push out and then you never know where it was positioned. Now the bush from the top of the camera, this gear, I'm just forcing a bit of synthetic grease in there. It doesn't need any more than that. And just a wipe in the centre where it runs around that shaft. Fit that into position. And I'll just turn that sprocket film take-up spool with my thumb to allow that gear to engage with the gear that was on that clutch. That part's in place. Two screws hold this in position. This screw towards the back, this also supports acts as a support for the cocking rack. And to the front there's a little ratchet pull that goes in. And there's a bush that goes under the ratchet pull. Now this bush is countersunk on one face, plain on the other. It should be plain side up. If you put countersunk side up, you'll end up in grief. Because what happens is that this screw will effectively, the shoulder on the screw will enter the countersink, and it means that the pull for the ratchet is not free to move because it's been clamped down firmly. So the bush must be plain side up, not countersunk side up. I'll get this in position, get that screwed down, check that the pull moves freely. It does. I'll just nip those two screws up. May come back and reposition those yet, which I'll speak about shortly. Now there is a spring, return spring, that goes on here, and I don't see it. Here it is. It's doing its best to escape. I'll just check that. That looks good. That's the return spring for the pull, and I'll just have to get this thing pushed into place over that screw head. There's a groove around the head of that screw that spring sits down into. And it does not want to go today. Like all springs, it's keen to escape, so be cautious with this because it'll be going for the boundary if we let it. There we go. That spring's in place, so that ratchet pull is pushing in that direction. The gear. This is the gear. Now I'm just going to apply a little bit of synthetic grease to the inside of that. And if I rotate that anti-clockwise, it should push the pull out of the way as it goes and drop into position. It does. One more notch, I think. Loop. There's a spring here. This leaf spring, which doesn't really need any grease in terms to function, but I always give it a little wipe, mostly just to ensure that it is safe from corrosion. Because being spring steel, it's a little bit prone to, high carbon steel is more prone to corrosion. Get that in place, get this little drive dog in place, that washer, the gear, and then we have the screw that holds it all together. There it is. Sometimes you can't see things for looking. Right. Just run that screw down, being careful not to disturb that gear from the squared shaft. That's good. I can tighten that up. So the advanced shaft is now all in place, tightened up, ready to go. At the bottom of the camera, I want to put the lock lever. This locking lever here locks the rewind button in position when it's been pressed in. so you don't have to hold it in all the time you're rewinding the film, which is something that you have to do with some cameras. So I'll just put a bit of molybdenum paste on the end of that, and I'll slide that into position. That sits right there. It has its return spring, which sits right there. There's a stepped screw that runs through this and holds the spring and the lever to the bottom of the body. And getting this centered up sometimes a bit tricky. There we go, that's it. The spring needs to be hooked behind that lever so that it's doing its job. That's it, like that. Now I want the sprocket shaft. So I've got the sprocket shaft and the film sprocket. We'll need a couple of other components. The button spring, and the washer. And one last piece. Make sure I've got the appropriate piece. That'll do. There. That screw. So, from the top of the camera, open the back of the camera, get the sprocket in. The slot goes upwards. Got the shaft here. Take some synthetic grease, run it around the base of the shaft at that point. Some towards the top. That's where it runs through the body. Usually I put a smear on the gear itself too. This is where it engages with the film advance. Then drop that down from the top of the camera through the sprocket. From the base of the camera I can fish in and align it, pull back that tab, push it all the way down, and now I've got to get the screw in that drives the sprocket from the sprocket shaft. There's a screw hole there, and there's a small screw that goes in there and drives this, and sometimes this goes in very easily and other times it fights every inch of the way. There, it's going in great. That's ideal. At the base of the camera we have our rewind button. I was just looking, I thought that was bent, but I think it's just an optical illusion. Right, so the spring, I'll lubricate the spring lightly with a bit of synthetic grease. Put the spring on the button. Put the washer on the button. This screws to the bottom of that sprocket shaft. And you have to fiddle with this sometimes to make sure that the button is able to pass through the washer, that it's not caught on the washer. That's all good, and I can tighten that in position because I've got a pair of pliers suitably mutilated to do that. Right. I'll just check that that button is in fact tight. I'm pretty sure it is. Oh yes, it is. you hold your finger against the sprocket on the inside, and you can do the screw up as tight as you can against your finger. You'll soon know when it's tight enough because it's uncomfortable. That's good. Well, those are the components in the base of the camera. I can tension the film advance, put the trim on the base of the camera, put the film advance lever on the base of the camera, and carry on from there. At the top of the camera, at the top of the camera, let's do this first. Put this chrome trim in place. And we've got our strap lug at this end of the body with 2 screws that'll hold everything in place. That just reminds me, as I press down on the top there, of course the back's sprung open because I haven't got my tripod socket in yet, so we'll put the tripod socket on the base of the camera. Get all 3 screws in position, then tighten them up. Those screw heads are just very slightly distorted. If the screw heads are slightly dished in, that's a sign that they were done up so tight that the top of the screw was effectively pulled together. So the slot was effectively narrow, because the screw's been pulled up so tight that it's been pulled in. So they were done up tight at one stage. Do those up, that's good. I better get the film advance stuff ready to go on there, and we want the chrome trim for the base of the camera. Good. Right, so this film advance. I want to get this film advance shaft tensioned. So first I'm just going to lift the lock lever out of the way, hold my release lever out of the way, rotate the advance shaft 1 full turn, drop the lock lever back in position, and being careful not to drop this down on the bench and disturbing things. Put some screws in the chrome trim from the base plate. Making sure that these screws I'm using here are all the nickel plated screws. There are 2 screws just like this, they're chrome plated, that hold the top cover on. And make sure you don't use them up somewhere else in the camera, or it'll be just like one I serviced recently where there were 2 chrome screws to be found holding the base plate on, and 2 new chrome screws were used on the top cover after they discovered that they didn't have the ones they wanted. I've got to be very careful to support this from the bench at this point, because if I hit the lock lever from above, it will disengage and the film advance shaft will revolve, and I'll lose that turn of tension that I've put on there, which would be a nuisance. All my screws are in place. I'm going to tighten the first 3 here immediately and fit my advance lever in place, which is held in place with 3 screws. Right, now I'm safe. The third screw I don't need to put in at this stage, that's enough to do the job. I can get these other screws tightened up on the base, but my film advance is no longer in danger of becoming disengaged. So I press down the release lever, hold down the lock lever, I can swing the film advance. That's nice and smooth in its action. The return is good, and that's just as it should be. So that's the base of the camera pretty much dealt with. I've got to come back and put the leatherette on here, but I won't do that at this stage. Next I want to put the cocking rack in place. So I'll apply some synthetic lubricant to that. The cocking rack in this case is worn, but it's more than serviceable. There's a little bit of distortion on the teeth, and I was able to deal with that particular problem. Now I'm just checking the position of this, making sure it's got room to move. It does. That looks good. And I can put this piece in place. This piece holds it down. Now this originally had spacer washers underneath it, which may or may not be required. So I'm just going to run a screw in here lightly. It's not uncommon for shims to have been fitted originally, but they may no longer be needed just because clearances have grown just organically, it's just as stuff wears. So it's not always obvious that all the shims need to go back. In some cases you may find that you need shims where you didn't need shims originally. For one particular reason. One reason it might be, for example, if the cocking rack had been replaced at some stage. It may not, maybe just slightly different in dimension than the original, and it might need shims where the original did not. You don't know until you try it, really. Right, so we'll try that. That's stiff. It's very stiff in its action. It's a little bit lumpy in its action too. So that tells me that there's a little bit too much downward pressure on that rack. So I will remove the screw at this end and put a spacer shim washer under there. And